Good evening, everyone. My name is Jerry Ilar, the Public Events and Engagement Coordinator for DC Public Schools on the Communications and Engagement, or in the Communications and Engagement Office. I want to thank you, everyone, for joining us today for a Parent University session on A Parent's Guide to Section 504, Supports for Students with Disabilities. And so before we get started, we do want to share that we have a couple of upcoming Parent University workshops today. For this month and for December. So for November, we have 2 sessions, one in Spanish on the 19th and one on the 18th for ECE, or Early Childhood Education parents. And then in December, we have 4 sessions to round out the calendar year. We have Talking About Race with Your Child on December 3rd. On December 10th, Navigating the My DC School Lottery and Exploring Options at DCPS. And then on the 16th, Building Children's Language Skills with ECE. And then we have another session talking about race with your child on the 17th. And so to sign up for these sessions, you can go to bit.ly/DCPS Parent U RSVP, and we should have all of the 6 sessions for you to sign up. And then if you need subtitles or interpretation, we have subtitles available in Chinese, French, Spanish, and Vietnamese and English. And then to get to those subtitles, you'll need to go to the bottom right of your screen, click on the gear button, and on the gear button, there will be an option for captions and subtitles, and choose the subtitles that you need. And then if you need Spanish interpretation, there should be an announcement being made in your Q&A. Going to bit.ly/ I believe it's DCPS Espanol, and then that will be held in a Zoom session. And then for the Q&A function, for some of you who are new to Microsoft Teams, go ahead, use the Q&A chat. There's a couple questions that will be asking for you to engage with us during the session today. And so you can use that to ask questions, post comments, and then also answer any questions for the Icebreaker or any other SEL openers that we may have throughout the presentation. And so you can ask your questions or post your comments anonymously, or you can ask them with your name or email tied to it. If there is a specific question that you need that is private or confidential, go ahead, just mark that within your question, and then someone on our side will be able to answer your question or comments. Confidentiality or confidential, sorry. And then we will also share a couple of emails for you to reach out to throughout the end. And then for the community agreement, we want to make sure that you assume best intentions, go hard on ideas, not on people, and then accept non-closure as we continue today's Parent University session. And so without further ado, I do want to introduce our presenter, Timothy Vance, who is a specialist under Section 504 in Student Accommodations in the Office of School Improvement and Supports. And so he will be able to answer any questions you have on 504 if it's new to you, or how to navigate the process. And so I'm going to turn it over to Tim.
Thank you so much, Jerry. Good evening, everyone. As Jerry said, my name is Tim Vance. I'm a specialist with the Section 504 and Student Accommodations team at DCPS. It's a privilege to be able to speak with you all tonight about the DCPS Section 504 program. Section 504 can be a really critical support for students with disabilities and chronic medical conditions, and informed parents are really best equipped and able to advocate for their students and to participate in the 504 process. So we're going to start off the presentation today with a quick icebreaker. I call it the Section 504 temperature check. During my time with DCPS, I found that many parents and even some school staff are unfamiliar with what Section 504 is and how the Section 504 process works in schools. So I wanted to first get a Section 504 temperature check from you all to see what, if anything, you all have heard about Section 504 before today, and whether you've ever participated in a 504 meeting, have any exposure to the 504 process in general. So there's definitely no wrong answer here, so please feel free to submit your answers in the chat box. We're going to go ahead on to the next slide and give you all a chance to respond, and we're going to loop back shortly and kind of get a sense of where we're at. So a little bit about the Section 504 team and kind of where we sit in DCPS organizationally. In DCPS, the Section 504 team is part of the Office of School Improvement and Supports, or OSIS as we call it. And the Office of School Improvement and Supports' mission is to work to dramatically accelerate the number of excellent DCPS schools through school transformation, including design, partnerships, connected schools, and comprehensive school planning. The office develops, aligns, and delivers high-quality supports to ensure students, particularly students furthest away from opportunity, are in school, able to engage in rigorous learning, and have a joyous educational environment. OSIS also ensures that our schools have excellent leaders, educators, and staff who are prepared to meet the diverse needs of the young people we serve. So if you all have any questions about OSIS and the work that we do, we have the office's email address on the screen, so feel free to reach out and we will be in touch with more information and happy to respond to your questions. So now we can go back and see if we have any responses to our Section 504 temperature check icebreaker.
Yeah, so Tim, we actually just have questions from the Eventbrite registration. I think some people are just still filling out questions or the answers to the Q&A or the icebreaker, but I think some questions that people have asked through the registration is, can you have related services under 504? Do I need a 504 and an IEP for my son with ADHD? And so I think we can hold off on those answers in the next Q&A box, but that's where some of the questions are leaning towards for tonight.
Great. Thanks, Jerry. Yeah, those are some great questions, and we'll definitely cover both of those questions shortly in our slides. So we're going to start off first to talk a little bit about what Section 504 is and really how is it different from special education. These are some of the questions I often get from parents and school staff. Kind of what is the difference between Section 504 and a 504 plan and special education and an IEP, which sometimes folks are more familiar with, but there's definitely some important differences that we'll dig into right now. So Section 504 is actually a federal civil rights law that prohibits discrimination against people with disabilities and all programs that receive money from the federal government. So Section 504 covers non-discrimination protections much more broadly than just in the public school setting. It's actually the first federal civil rights law offering protections for individuals with disabilities. And we'll come back to this point throughout, but it's really important to emphasize that Section 504 is a federal civil rights law, so its focus is on ensuring equal access and equal protections and preventing discrimination, which is kind of a different focus than some of the other education laws that we deal with in the school setting. Great, so I think in the public school context, Section 504 protections are intended to guarantee equal access to the curriculum for students with disabilities. Specifically, the law requires that public schools provide the necessary accommodations and related services to eligible students with disabilities so they can access the general education curriculum, opportunities for learning, and school activities to the same extent as their non-disabled peers. So really, as I said, the broad point of Section 504 is to ensure equal access for students. Students with 504 plans are general education students, so they're held to the same standards as any other general education students. The role of Section 504 here is just to provide the supports that they need to have the same opportunities to succeed as their non-disabled peers. So Section 504 and special education, we want to kind of dig into some of those big differences right now. Section 504, as we've talked about, is a federal civil rights law, and the Individuals with Disabilities Education Act, or the IDEA, which is the main law that kind of governs the special education process in public schools. These are two different vehicles to address student disability. So both laws have different purposes and a different legal framework. As we've said, Section 504 speaks about access, and that's because it's a federal civil rights law. So it prohibits disability based discrimination and requires schools to provide the support students' needs. And it focuses on ensuring that students with disabilities have a level playing field. By contrast, the Individuals with Disabilities Education Act, or the IDEA, is a federal education law for children with disabilities, and this law has stricter eligibility criteria and ultimately different goals for what it hopes to accomplish in supporting students. One important point of difference is the eligibility criteria. Section 504's eligibility criteria is very broad compared to the IDEA. We'll discuss this in greater detail shortly, but for a student to be eligible for under Section 504, to be eligible for a 504 plan, they must have a physical or mental impairment which substantially limits one or more major life activities. Again, that's kind of jargony language, and we'll dig into what that means in greater detail shortly, but just wanted to point out to start with that this is really a kind of general eligibility criteria that captures a really broad net to support students with disabilities and chronic medical conditions. The IDEA's criteria goes a step beyond that. For a student to be eligible for special education, they must have one of the 13 specific disability categories that are listed in the law, and the disability must significantly impact the student's learning or educational performance. And finally, and I think this is really the key difference, is whether or not that impact on the student's educational performance can only be addressed by providing special education. So in other words, a student must need specialized instruction or special education to make progress in school in order to be eligible for the IDEA. Under Section 504, the accommodations and services necessary to ensure equal access are documented in a 504 plan. And again, we'll talk a little bit more later about what a 504 plan is. In contrast, the students eligible under the IDEA receive an individual educational program, or an IEP, which is the plan or document developed to ensure that the student with disability receives specialized instructions and the accommodations or modifications that they need. So if you were trying to think through generally whether a IEP or a 504 plan would be a better fit for your student, I wanted to take this opportunity to kind of talk through which category of students would kind of be best fit for each of these educational programs, which law would best fit to serve your student. So we have a visualization on this slide here with kind of concentric circles. Where if we think most broadly about the category of all students with chronic medical conditions or disabilities would be our largest category, and then there's a smaller subset of those students who would meet the Section 504 eligibility criteria, who would be eligible for a 504 plan. And within those 504 eligible students, there's an even smaller group of students who would also meet the IDEA eligibility criteria, who would be eligible for special education. So all students who are eligible for special education are also eligible for 504 protections, but the reverse is not true. Not all 504 eligible students also meet the IDEA's eligibility criteria. In DCPS, a student cannot have a 504 plan and an IEP at the same time. So if you have a student who currently has a 504 plan and is then later found eligible for special education, we would exit that student from 504 and then move all of the accommodations and supports listed on that 504 plan and include those on the student's new IEP. Great, so we have that was a quick 10,000-foot overview of the law. We didn't want to get too much into the weeds of a lot of legal jargon, but wanted to pause now to see if there's any initial questions on kind of the broad understanding of what Section 504 is and how it differs from special education.
We do have one question. How are kids with IEPs / 504s getting equal access if some children are being allowed in? Sorry. So this is talking a little bit more about in-person versus virtual. And from my understanding, Tim, is that right now we are doing all virtual learning, correct?
That is correct.
Okay.
Right, so I get in general in virtual learning because Section 504 is a civil rights law focused on ensuring equal access. The goal of the law in virtual learning is to ensure that students with disabilities have the same access to that virtual learning curriculum as non-disabled students do, so that they have the same access to the educational opportunities provided to any DCPS student, regardless of their disability status.
Perfect. And so a couple of questions just on 504 and IEPs. And so there were a couple of questions that said, do I need a 504 in an IEP for my son with ADHD or speech therapy? And then from your explanation is that you do not need a 504 and an IEP, it's one or the other, correct? Can you elaborate a little bit more?
Yeah, so as we said, the supports that can be provided through an IEP, that's really specialized education, go much farther beyond the supports that can be provided through a 504 plan. So in DCPS, students cannot have a 504 plan or an IEP at the same time. If a student meets the eligibility requirements for an IEP, all those supports that the student needs should be provided through the IEP, and they don't need a 504 plan at the same time. So we don't have both in DCPS. We have to have one or the other. And again, if the student's eligible for an IEP, that would supersede the 504 plan, and those supports would move over and be documented through the IEP.
Perfect. And then in terms of parents not knowing about 504s or a 504, who would be the person that would be either suggesting that or helping the parents navigate the process within their school? Would it be a teacher? Would it be a counselor? How does that initial conversation start up? And what can a parent expect with that conversation?
Absolutely, it's a great question. Every DCPS school has at least one Section 504 coordinator. This is a school-based staff member who also serves in the role as a 504 coordinator, and their job is to oversee the 504 process in the school building. So they are the main point of contact for parents and school staff to answer questions about Section 504. If you are considering referring your student to the 504 process, definitely reach out to your school, find out who the 504 coordinator is, and raise that concern. They'd be happy to answer any questions you have. If you have any general questions about 504, you're also more than welcome to reach out to me and the DCPS Central Office 504 team. I'm always happy to reach out and have a phone call with families to discuss what the Section 504 program is, make some connections between you and the relevant school staff members, and help ensure the process runs smoothly.
Perfect. I think we'll hold off on additional questions now and continue with the presentation.
Great. So now that we talked generally about what Section 504 is, we're now going to turn and talk in greater detail about how the Section 504 process works in DCPS. So the Section 504 process in DCPS, I think of as having four main stages. It begins when a 504 coordinator receives a referral for a student to Section 504. The 504 coordinator then convenes a 504 team meeting to determine if the student is eligible. If the team finds the student eligible, if the student meets the 504 eligibility criteria, the team goes on to develop a 504 plan for the student. Again, that 504 plan will contain the accommodations and services the student needs to have a level playing field, to have an equal opportunity to succeed in school. So after the 504 plan is created, it's distributed to all staff members who regularly work with the student, so teachers, related service providers, anybody in the school building who's regularly interacting with the student, as well as to the family. 504 plans are reviewed every year, and 504 eligibility is reviewed every 3 years. So those are the four main steps broadly, and now we can turn and talk about each of these steps in greater detail so that we can ensure everybody understands what each of these steps means. As I said, the first step of the 504 process is the referral. A Section 504 referral is basically a request for 504 evaluation and services. School staff, families, anybody who's knowledgeable about the students can refer a student to the 504 process. And really, any student with a disability or a suspected disability who requires accommodations or services in school should be referred for 504 evaluation. So again, as I said, a 504 referral can come from anybody who knows the student. It's often from a parent, but certainly school staff members also do refer students who they see as needing potentially additional supports in the classroom setting. Really, there's no magic word for 504 referral, so you don't need to feel like when you're talking to the school-based 504 coordinator that you have to say a certain sentence in order to trigger a 504 referral. Really, what you are doing is saying, I have a student who has a disability, or I suspect they have a disability, and I think they need some additional supports, and that really is enough to trigger the 504 referral. This can come in an in-person conversation, in a phone call, and an email. We also have a formal Section 504 referral form on our website. You are welcome to use that too, but I would say 95% of referrals come through just a conversation with a school staff member, with the 504 coordinator, so that don't feel the need to kind of go through the formal process. Just having that conversation with the 504 coordinator is enough to start the process. So, as we said, once the student's referred, the school-based 504 coordinator will bring the team together to hold an eligibility meeting. And as I said earlier, under Section 504, a student is eligible. They're considered to be an individual with a disability under the law if they have a physical or mental impairment that substantially limits one or more major life activities. So I think of this eligibility criteria as having two parts, two prongs. And so for a student to be eligible, they have to meet both of these two criteria. In order to come to this determination, the 504 team meets. This is the 504 coordinator, the parents, hopefully the student's teachers, and other school staff who know the student well. They bring together all the information they have on the student. So this could be health reports, medical records, grades, parent observations, teacher observations, the information that we have on the student and how the student's disability may be impacting them. The team reviews this documentation and then determines whether, based on that information, the student meets the eligibility criteria. So now I know that the wording sounds very jargony, very legalese. So we're going to now talk, and we're going to break both of these components apart and really understand what this means in reality. So the first part, the physical or mental impairment, unlike, as we said, unlike under the Individuals with Disabilities in Education Act, which has 13 specific disability categories that a student must meet in order to be eligible for special education, Section 504 is much broader. Really, a student could be eligible for 504 with any physical or mental impairment. Anything that could be diagnosed by a provider could potentially lead a student to be eligible. Most often, a student is considered to have a physical or mental impairment if they have a medical diagnosis from a professional stating that they are receiving treatment for a condition. And really, this is important information for the 504 team to have. A medical report, a letter from a doctor can be really critical evaluation information, both for determining eligibility under 504, and also if the student is eligible to determine what supports would be appropriate to include in a 504 plan. That said, medical documentation is not required as a step for 504 eligibility. So even if your student is not formally diagnosed with a condition, but you suspect that they have a disability or a chronic medical condition, you can and should still refer them to the 504 process if you feel that this process will lead to critical supports for them. If they do need extra supports in the school setting, don't feel discouraged because you don't have a formal medical diagnosis yet. The 504 team can still proceed, still determine eligibility. The second part of the 504 eligibility criteria is that physical or mental impairment has to substantially limit a major life activity. And I think this second prong is really the most critical part of the 504 eligibility criteria. It's where the team will focus most. So as I said, the 504 team will use the information they have on the student, parent observations, teacher observations, medical documentation, to determine how the disability is impacting the student. And they are making that determination by comparing the student to the average student of the same age. Major life activities under the law are any activities that are important in daily life or necessary for the student to access the curriculum. The law itself has a list of major life activities, but the 504 team is always welcome to consider other major life activities other than those listed in the law. So I wouldn't, from a parent's perspective, wouldn't worry too much about defining each major life activity, but just understanding that really we're looking for any area that is important in daily life or for your student's educational performance. Those are the areas that we're looking for potential impacts. It's not just an academic impact. It's really, it could be walking, it could be breathing, it could be concentrating, it could be thinking. Really, we're looking at a full range of important activities for students. So again, it's not enough for a student to just have a diagnosis to be eligible. The 504 team is asking, what is the impact of the disability on the student's performance? So for example, if a student, a 6th grade student, has a diagnosis for ADHD and student's parent is concerned that the student has trouble concentrating, the 504 team will come together and review all the information they have to determine whether that issue with concentrating is substantial compared to the average 6th grader, the average student in the same age. So that is what the 504 team is doing at the eligibility meeting, and that is how the 504 eligibility process works in a nutshell. So if the student's found eligible, the 504 team goes on to create the 504 plan, which, as I've said, is the blueprint for how the school team is going to support the student. The 504 plan contains the accommodations and related services the team determines are necessary for the student to have equal access to the curriculum. So they are using the same information that they use to determine eligibility. They're looking at what the student's disability is, how does the disability impact the student's ability to access the curriculum, and then what accommodations or related services are necessary to give that student an equal playing field and equal opportunity to succeed as their peers. So going back again to our discussion about the differences between Section 504 and special education. As we said, a 504 plan can contain accommodations, which are changes in instruction, in the presentation of material, in the formatting of material, in the setting or the timing that the student receives instructions. But these accommodations do not alter the curriculum. And this is an important point in a difference between Section 504 and special education. Accommodations are provided through a 504 plan, and again, they allow the student to access the curriculum. A modification to the curriculum, changing what the student is required to know, is provided that this ultimately is the specialized education that we discuss as being a part of the IEP. So any modifications to the curriculum would have to come through an IEP, as 504 students are general education students. As we've said, they're held to the same standards as any general education student. So we're not going to include accommodations on a plan that's going to change what a student is expected to know or expected to provide for their class. Really, the goal for these accommodations is to ensure that the student is able to equally access the classroom materials and opportunities for learning. So we talked a little bit about classroom and in-school accommodations. We have our pyramid for 504 supports here. I don't know if it's showing up as well on the slide, but at the bottom of the pyramid, we have the instructional and classroom accommodations, because students ultimately spend most of their time in the school day in the classroom setting. The 504 plan can also include a behavior management plan. If your student has a behavior intervention plan or otherwise requires accommodations to the school's behavior system, these supports can be rolled into the 504 plan and attached to the 504 plan so that they are distributed together, so all staff members are on the same page in terms of what supports the student needs. Students can also receive related services through their 504 plan, again, if those related services are necessary for the student to access the curriculum. And by related services in DCPS, the related service umbrella, we're talking about behavioral support services, audiology, physical therapy, occupational therapy, and speech language pathology. So our related service colleagues, those related service providers, are critical members of the 504 team for those meetings, and they will lead the team in determining whether those services are necessary for the student. But certainly we have students with 504 plans receiving all 5 of those related services throughout DCPS. Students can also receive assistive technology if it's necessary through their 504 plan. And assistive technology, and this is probably a topic that could go for a whole other parent university discussion, but these are different either high-tech or low-tech technologies that can be provided through the 504 process if regular classroom accommodations are not sufficient for the student to access the curriculum. So maybe this is speech-to-text software that can be provided through a tablet. Maybe this is a hearing FM system for students who have hearing impairments. There's a full range of technologies that are available for students in the 504 process. And again, DCPS has its own assistive technology team who we would consult with as part of the 504 process, and they would lend their expertise to determine whether assistive technology would be necessary for a student. And then we would document that in the 504 plan, and that could be certainly provided. And finally, students can receive accommodations for standardized testing. This is for our park accommodation or park testing, main standardized tests that we provide through DCPS. But these standardized testing accommodations would also apply to any standardized test DCPS provides. And really, if a student needs any accommodation for a regular classroom test and quiz, that's probably a good sign for the 504 team that they also need that same accommodation for standardized testing. So as I said, once the 504 plan is written, once the team agrees on which accommodations and related services are necessary to provide that equal level of access for the student, the plan is distributed to all adults in the building who regularly work with the student, and certainly a copy is also provided to the family so you can review that. The team comes back together every year to review the 504 plan, just to make sure that the accommodations as written are still sufficient to ensure equal access for the student. If any accommodations need to be added to the plan, if any accommodations need to be reworded to ensure that they are providing that equal level of access, that's what the 504 team will discuss at that meeting. 504 eligibility is reviewed every 3 years. And again, at this eligibility meeting, the team is going through to make sure that the student still meets the 504 eligibility requirements. So this meeting only happens once every 3 years, but this is an opportunity for the team just to make sure that they've identified the major needs for the student and that our documentation is up to date. But just because those meetings must be held every year or every 3 years doesn't mean that the team cannot meet before then. Any member of the 504 team can request a 504 meeting at any time. So if right after you have an initial 504 plan and it's been a couple months and you notice your student is still struggling, if there's still disability related impacts, you are able to request a 504 meeting to come back, to bring the team back together to update the plan. We don't have to wait for that full 1 year time period to go by. The 504 team will also meet if there's a significant change in placement. And typically what this means is if a student is suspended for more than 10 school days in a school year, the 504 team will come together to determine whether that the behavior that led to the suspension was a manifestation of the student's disability. We won't get into that in too much detail there, but these are kind of the main reasons beyond the initial meeting and timeframes for the 504 team to meet and to ensure that supports are up to date and meeting a student's current needs. So again, just to recap, the 504 process begins with the referral. The 504 team then meets to determine eligibility. If the student's eligible, the team writes the 504 plan. The 504 plan is then reviewed every year, and 504 eligibility is reviewed every 3 years. So that was a quick whirlwind look at the 504 process in DCPS. So I wanted to take a moment to pause to see if there are any questions about the process, any aspects that you have questions about or that you would like me to discuss in further detail. Please feel free to type those into the chat box.
So as we're waiting for some questions, one, Tim, I'm not sure if you're able to answer this, but what are some common impairments or reasons why that families would be receiving a 504? So you mentioned physical or mental impairments or chronic medical illnesses. And so I know you talked about a little bit about speech or ADHD, but I'm not sure if you're able to give a little bit more depth of
Sure.
Other examples that families may be coming across.
Yeah, absolutely. So we can give a couple examples for each of those broad categories. For mental health impairments, we have a lot of students with 504 plans for ADHD, PTSD, anxiety, depression, autism. So really a full range of diagnosable mental health impairments can lead to a student to be eligible for a 504 plan. For physical impairments, we have students with mobility impairments, certainly could be eligible for a 504 plan. So students who require wheelchairs, students who otherwise have other physical impairments that prevent them from moving around the school building, from getting to school, from accessing the different parts in the school. That's certainly a reason to refer them for the 504 process, to make sure that they are able to get to the different parts of the school building they need to engage in their classroom activities, to interact with their peers and on an equal footing as non-disabled students. And for chronic medical conditions, it's really, the full range of conditions that exist in a physician's handbook. We have a lot of students with diabetes, asthma, food allergies, sickle cell disease. All of these chronic medical conditions can certainly lead to a 504 plan. And for chronic medical conditions, we largely lean on medical orders from an outside provider and then discuss with the school team whether there's additional classroom accommodations that are necessary beyond just the medical care to ensure that the student has equal access to the educational opportunities as well.
Awesome. One other question on standardized testing. How does that impact high school students and SATs or ACTs or just college placement testing? Does the 504 impact that, and how does that actually carry on into the college career for a student?
Absolutely, that's a great question. So for the SAT, the College Board, the organization that that oversees the SAT and PSAT and AP tests, they are ultimately the gatekeepers, really, of the accommodations that they provide for they allow students to have on their exams. That said, at every DCPS school that offers or delivers SAT tests, there's a designated staff member whose role it is to work with the 504 coordinator and the family to ensure that applications for accommodations are submitted to the College Board ahead of time. So certainly having a 504 plan and having testing accommodations there is a good piece of evidence. in support of a application for the College Board for accommodations on their assessments, and school staff are there to help families submit those applications and make sure that they meet the deadlines and have the supporting documentation that they need. And those same staff members who assist with SATs are also available to submit with or assist with accommodation requests for ACT accommodations and yeah.
Perfect. And then I think this is one last question. I'm not sure if you're able to answer this. This is a little bit more nuanced, but think about assistive technology. And so if a plan does call for assistive technology for parents or families, do families have to worry about any of the budgets or paying for that, or does that come out of the school? How does, and then additionally, if having a 504 plan, how does that help some of our higher need parents who just need additional funding to help pay for things? Does 504 plans do anything on that piece, or is it mainly on the school front and making sure that students have all the resources available for them?
Great questions there. So if the 504 team determines the student needs assistive technology, that is provided by DCPS through the assistive technology team at no cost to families. That said, eligibility for assistive technology is based on the impact of the student's disability and not necessarily on families' financial means. So while those pieces of assistive technology will be provided at no cost, that the determination for eligibility is based solely on the impact of the disability and the necessity for the technology, rather than serving as a way to support families who may not otherwise be able to afford that type of technology outside of the 504 process.
Cool. And then one last question before moving forward, and I might be jumping ahead. What are some tips that you have for parents in thinking about stigmas around 504s or even just like the IEP process, so that students feel that they're comfortable, they're not going to be stigmatized for having a 504 plan?
Yeah, absolutely. I think it's really important for students to understand their strengths and areas for growth, to understand the impacts of their disability on them. So I think ultimately hiding that information from the students can oftentimes have a lot more negative impact than being fearful about being stigmatized. Certainly in the public school setting, school staff are there to support our students, and they understand that the 504 plan contains the accommodations that are necessary for students to have an equal opportunity to succeed. Beyond that, I think the earlier we can encourage our students to take part in the 504 process, to understand what supports they need to be successful in school and beyond, this is really important information, because once they leave DCPS and move on to college and career, ultimately they need to have an understanding of what supports they need to be successful, how to go out and be an advocate for themselves, and how to ensure that they are being a self-advocate for themselves and ensuring that they can be successful. So I understand that there's sometimes concern about stigma around a disability, but it's a federal civil rights law that's really intended to ensure that students with disabilities have an equal opportunity to succeed and can be a really powerful tool.
Thank you, Tim. I'm gonna go ahead, turn it back to you to carry on the presentation.
Great. So now we're gonna close out with a short discussion about Section 504 during virtual learning and how families and schools can collaborate to support 504 eligible students. So during virtual learning, while many things have changed, the way that students receive information, the way that content is covered, the obligations under the law for DCPS to ensure that eligible students have the supports they need haven't changed. What that looks like, though, can change between in-person and virtual learning. We know that each student with a 504 plan has unique needs, and so there's really not there's no one-size-fits-all model for providing 504 supports during virtual learning. Really, it's a collaborative process between the family and the school team to kind of identify whether there are additional needs, different areas that need to be supported during virtual learning. And they come together and update the 504 plan to make sure that those supports and protections are in place and the student can have equal access whether instruction is virtually or in person. So as I said, since Section 504 is a civil rights law focused on ensuring equal access, and in in-person learning, that means a student has equal access to the classroom instruction, equal access to the different parts of the school building. During virtual learning, the obligations are refocused on ensuring that students have equal access to the virtual learning curriculum. So this is the primary role for the 504 program now during virtual learning. That said, the 504 process is continuing in DCPS. All 504 meetings are going forward and continue to be held, obviously not in person, but these are being held either by phone or through Microsoft Teams. And if you are a parent of a student with a 504 plan, it's important to understand that teachers are still expected to implement all relevant accommodations on a student's 504 plan to the greatest extent possible during virtual learning. And this is guidance that comes directly down from the U.S. Department of Education. What I mean by this, relevant during virtual learning, some accommodations, the way they are written, are intended to address an impact in a classroom in-person environment. So if a student requires preferential seating near the front of the classroom during in-person learning, that's not really an accommodation that is relevant during virtual learning. Students are learning from home, so the teacher can't really seat them closer to instruction. But all relevant accommodations, if a student needs assignments to be broken down into smaller chunks so that they can help manage their time better, if the student needs additional organizational support from a teacher, all of these accommodations that can and still be implemented during virtual learning will be implemented. And it's, oftentimes a conversation between families and the school team to try to figure out how to adapt and implement different accommodations in the virtual setting. Again, because there's no one-size-fits-all model for 504 plans in virtual learning, the way that we tweak and adapt accommodations to the virtual setting can look different for different students. But this is definitely a conversation that the school team would be more than happy to have with you. Again, if you're a parent with a student with an existing 504 plan, definitely reach out to the 504 coordinator at your school if you have concerns about how the 504 plan is looking during virtual learning or how you think it could be improved. So again, if your student is having difficulties accessing virtual instruction, if you have a student currently eligible for a 504 plan and they're having difficulties accessing virtual instruction, please contact your 504 coordinator for support. This would be a great reason to come back together and update the 504 plan to make sure that the accommodations are addressing the current impacts on the student. Just because if a 504 plan was written last school year during in-person learning, maybe there's some additional needs that weren't really showing themselves in the in-person setting that now need to be addressed. So strongly encourage you to reach out to your school's 504 coordinator. And again, if you suspect that your student has a disability or they have a diagnosed disability and you feel that they need additional supports during virtual learning, please also reach out to your school's 504 coordinator to begin the 504 process. Those school staff are there to help ensure that your student is able to succeed in virtual learning and have the supports they need to ensure that they're not limited by the impacts of their disability. If any of you all have questions about the 504 process or how accommodations could work in virtual learning, I also encourage you to reach out to me at the Central Office Section 504 team. We'll certainly have my contact information on the screen at the end, but I'm always happy to talk to families and schools and help brainstorm to come up with a solution to help ensure that our students are supported. We know that given the pandemic and the ongoing social unrest that has really, impacted communities around the country this year, that many of our students will be experiencing new or exacerbated mental health concerns. So again, if your student has a mental health impairment, or you suspect that they do but haven't, due to the pandemic, been able to see a provider to have them formally diagnosed, please contact your school's 504 coordinator to begin the 504 process. We don't want to wait for students to return to in-person learning. If they have needs that need to be addressed right now, we want to encourage you to get in touch with your school's 504 coordinator to really start the process. Students with medical complications, chronic medical conditions, as we think about transitioning, hopefully at some point this school year, from virtual learning to in-person learning. I've gotten questions from many parents about the safety of students returning to in-person learning with complex medical conditions. Really, our focus from the 504 team is to ensure that those students' needs are met. Sometimes, based on the medical documentation, we can come up with a plan to ensure the student's safety, eventually returning to in-person learning. For other students, though, this will mean staying on virtual learning longer to ensure their safety. Ultimately, though, these decisions are made on a case-by-case basis by the school team. So if you have any questions or concerns about that, if you are a parent of a student with a 504 plan for a complex medical condition, please reach out to your 504 coordinator and get the conversation started now so that we can start developing a plan for how that transition back to in-person learning is going to look. Again, this is not a decision that we have to make now, but I think starting this conversation will put us in a good place for when DCPS begins to formally reopen, hopefully later on this school year. Good. I want to pause now to see if there are any additional questions on really anything that we've covered today on the 504 process, the difference between Section 504 and special education, 504 process during virtual learning, or any other 504 related questions.
Thanks, Tim. So one question I know you touched on and elaborated, but just want to bring it up again. So what if 504 accommodations aren't being provided during distance learning? And you said like teachers should be providing as much accommodations as possible if it is relevant. And then how much flexibility do teachers and schools have to adjust the schedule or requirements for kids with 504 plans? And so I guess the first question is, if a parent is seeing like the accommodations not being observed, what should be the plan of action? Should it be going directly to you, or should it be having the conversation with the teachers? And then what are some of the flexibilities and schedules with students with 504 plans?
Both are great questions. The first step, if you feel that a 504 accommodation is not being implemented, is to get in touch with your school's 504 coordinator to let them know. They are the main touch points at your school, and they will help address the issue to ensure that teachers understand that 504 plans are not optional, that these are legally binding documents, and that they are obligated to implement these accommodations. Also, please feel free to reach out to me at 504@k12.dc.gov. I'm always happy to serve as a liaison between parents and schools to make sure that everybody's on the same page and understands the expectations for school staff to implement 504 plans. So anything that I can do to be of support to families, I'd be more than happy to. So please do feel free to reach out. I'm always happy to hop on the phone and discuss any questions or concerns that you might have. And then the second question was modifying schedules, I believe. In general, scheduling largely exists outside of the 504 process. That said, if we have medical documentation to really demonstrate that a scheduling change is necessary, that maybe because of a medical condition, a student is more lethargic early in the morning, and so they need to have their more intense academic classes rescheduled to sometime later in the afternoon, that is certainly possible. And again, we would probably lean on recommendations from a medical provider to ensure that these are actually necessary scheduling changes, but if they are, there's certainly something that can be accomplished in the 504 process.
Awesome. We actually don't have many questions because I think you've answered most of them, but this is kind of a silly question on my half. So thinking about 504s or the 504 plan, this is like, I've actually haven't heard of the 504 plan until this year when you bring it up. So thinking about if a student gets a broken arm, could a student theoretically or family get referred for a 504 plan? Let's just say they're right-handed. This is like very nuanced, but I'm just curious, like what is the extent of a 504 plan with certain physical impairments or mental impairments? So just one example there, like would that technically fit under a 504 plan or not?
That's a great question, Jerry, and we're really getting into the nuances of 504 there. So in general, Section 504 is intended to address disabilities, not temporary injuries. So the general rule of thumb is that if a condition is going to resolve in 6 months or less, that's a temporary injury and doesn't really require the full weight of a federal civil rights law to address. And that's not to say that the school should not provide informal accommodations or supports to help a student with a broken arm, but that the broken arm may not rise to the level of, requiring a civil rights law to offer protections for. That said, this is not a hard and fast rule, and occasionally there are temporary injuries that are so severe that they really do substantially limit a student. For example, we've had students who break both of their legs and are unable to walk. And the severity of that injury, while it may resolve in 6 months, prevents the student from getting to school using public transportation. So on a case-by-case basis, the 504 team can determine that a temporary injury is so severe that it rises to the level of a 504 plan, but that would be a case-by-case determination by the school team. So certainly possible under the law, but it would more be the exception rather than the rule.
Awesome. So thank you, Tim, for leading the presentation today. That actually concludes our session for the Q&A piece for this evening. So I want to thank you again and your team for helping out with the Q&A and also leading the presentation today. And for upcoming Parent University sessions, we encourage you to register at bit.ly/DCPS Parent U RSVP. And there are 2 happening this month and then 4 happening in December. And then if you are looking for past Parent University sessions, we encourage you to go to our YouTube playlist and check out bit.ly/DCPS Parent U Recs or recordings, RECS. And that way you can check out tonight's recording, which we'll try to have up by the end of the day today, or sorry, the end of the day tomorrow or by Monday. And then I know there are probably questions about in-person learning and virtual learning and what will reopening look like. And so we encourage you to visit dcpsreopenstrong.com to access additional resources. From there, you'll be able to have some of your questions answered. And then if you do not have those questions answered, you can also contact ParentU at k12.dc.gov, one place. And then also if you have additional ideas of what a Parent University session could look like, you can email us there, or you can fill out our eval at ParentU-eval19 or 19 and let us know how we did today. And if there are more sessions that you would like Tim to lead in the future, especially around 504 planning and getting referrals. And so we want to thank you for joining us tonight, and we hope you can join us in our next session in the coming weeks. So thank you and have a pleasant evening.